And welcome to Eye on Africa, France 24's program focused on the continent. I'm Charlie James, and these are the headlines. Zimbabwe's opposition won't boycott the nation's upcoming presidential election. Despite saying the vote is threatened by fraud, the main opposition's chief says they will be victorious. Mali also just days away from a high-stakes presidential election, and security is in the spotlight. France 24's correspondents look at candidate and current President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita's first-term record. And Eritrea hopes securing peace with Ethiopia will open the door to tourism. Currently one of the least visited countries in the world, it's now telling foreigners it's open for business. We begin in Zimbabwe, where the biggest opposition party has announced it won't boycott Monday's historic election. This despite its belief that the Electoral Commission is working to improve President Emerson Mnangagwa's chances of winning. The MDC coalition alleges media manipulation, voter roll issues, and reports of ruling party candidates handing out food. The United Nations has also reported signs of voter intimidation. Still, MDC leader Nelson Chamisa, who is also Mnangagwa's main rival, remains confident.
We can't boycott ourselves. We as Zimbabwe. It's not possible to boycott our victory. That is what losers would want us to do. Now, we don't take advice from losers. We don't take advice from those who are defeated. We are very clear and very circumspect. Let us respect the will of the people.
Mnangagwa and the ruling ZANU-PF party hope a credible victory will legitimize the power they gained after toppling Robert Mugabe last November. Wednesday, Zimbabwe's foreign affairs minister emphasized the importance of a free and fair vote.
I have always said that this country has been a sleeping giant. It has got an opportunity to get confidence. And this confidence can only be exuded through such a peaceful, free, and a fair election like this one.
On Sunday, Mali will hold the first round of its presidential election, and security will be a major concern for people headed to the polls. There has been a surge of violence in the north and center of the country due to conflict between rival ethnic and religious groups. The UN says that nearly 300 civilians have been killed in this fighting. Despite the precarious security situation, 24 hopefuls are campaigning for the top office. One of the favorites is the incumbent president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita. But Keita's first term has been disappointing for many. France 24's team on the ground in Mali brings us this report.
Taking 77% of the vote in 2013, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita rode to victory on a wave of hope. The country had just emerged from a serious crisis. A coup d'etat had led to the occupation of the vast north of the country by jihadists, followed by French intervention. It was a time of radical change for the state.
Through the law of orientation and military planning, voted through by Parliament, a great deal of effort has been put into providing equipment for the army to combat terrorism. Another positive element of the president's record is the question of peace. When the president took office, there was fighting between Malians, between the Malian army and former rebels, and also between other armed groups. Then there's been the revival of the economy. Today we have a growth rate that has averaged 5% over the last 4 years, with record cereal and cotton production.
For a second term, Keita is emphasizing continuity, but the opposition is against this, criticizing the current corruption and worsening security situation.
The type of governance President Keita installed has been clannish, corrupt, disastrous. It's meant that after 5 years of this, Mali is on edge. The instability and insecurity that had been confined to the Kidal region have now spread throughout the entire north and beyond to the center of our country.
President Keita may be pushing continuity as what the country needs, but according to the latest report from the UN Secretary General, Central Mali saw 3 times as many security-related incidents in 2017 compared to the previous year.
Addressing Uganda's parliament Wednesday, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said Africa is at the top of India's priorities. Modi also pledged more support for African governments and revealed plans to open 18 new Indian embassies across the continent. Later in the day, he traveled to South Africa to attend the BRICS Emerging Markets Summit. France 24's correspondent in Uganda, Grania Harrington, sent us this report with more on Modi's two-day visit.
This was the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Uganda in over 20 years. Narendra Modi had a ceremonial welcome in Entebbe before holding bilateral talks with President Yoweri Museveni at State House. He then addressed the Ugandan Parliament today. He also held a large event for the Indian community here. Now, although they make up less than 1% of the population, they contribute around 60% to Uganda's direct tax revenue, making them a crucial business community here. And, of course, Indians have a long and complex relationship with Uganda. The entire community was expelled from the country in 1972 under dictator Idi Amin, and they were only invited back by current President Yoweri Museveni during the 1980s. And President Museveni also praised the contribution of the Indian community to Uganda's economy during Modi's visit. The two presidents signed a bilateral defence agreement, and they called for reform of the UN Security Council to make it more inclusive. President Modi also announced over $200 million worth of loans for energy and agriculture projects here in Uganda. Now, this is, of course, ahead of the BRICS summit, which is just starting in South Africa, and Modi wasn't the only delegate to make a stop over here. Chinese President Xi Jinping is also in the region, and this really highlights the competition between the two countries for influence here in Africa. President Modi said he wanted to deepen India's engagement with Africa, and he also announced the opening of 18 new Indian embassies across the continent.
To help save the Gile Nature Reserve in northern Mozambique, sustainable farming techniques are being promoted among local populations there. The goal is to create a win-win for both farmers and the environment by increasing yield and decreasing emissions.
Mozambique's Gile National Reserve is slowly dying. Its 2,800 square kilometers of biodiversity are being put at risk by illegal logging, but mainly the age-old use of slash-and-burn agriculture, a farming method which local populations living in the buffer zone of the reserve depend on to create new fields. To fight this ecologically destructive method of farming, a French NGO is training farmers to increase soil fertility through more sustainable agricultural practices.
Our goal is to make sure farmers cultivate the same field for as long as possible. Here, for example, the same farmer has cultivated the same field for 4 years.
But slash-and-burn farming isn't the only threat to the forest of Miombo. The production of coal is eating away at the forest, while also spitting out CO2 emissions, harmful to the environment. Here, coal men are learning to create new ovens that use less trees, but produce more high-quality coal.
Thanks to this new technique, we can produce up to 6 or 7 sacks of coal each time, whereas before we would only manage to produce 2 or 3.
The Gile National Reserve now wants to commercialize its efforts to fight deforestation by marketing carbon credits. The scheme allows CO2 emitters to buy credits in order to reduce their emissions, while supporting environmental projects in developing countries.
We've managed to reduce the annual deforestation rate in the buffer zone of the reserve. That is, greenhouse gas emissions have been avoided thanks to the alternatives put in place.
These efforts have reduced emissions by about 300,000 tons of carbon in 5 years. Each non-emitted ton of CO2 equals 1 carbon credit, the sale of which is expected to generate between $2 and $3 million that could help finance the preservation of the forest and more sustainable developments.
And finally, recent weeks have seen an incredible thaw in relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And now that their two leaders have made peace, Eritrea hopes that can boost its almost non-existent tourism industry.
In Eritrea, no one expected that the new Ethiopian Prime Minister would in June accept a 16-year-old border ruling and thus finally make peace with his neighbour. Since then, flights have resumed between the two countries. The first Ethiopian tourists have arrived in the port of Massawa on the Red Sea, not far from the Dahlak Islands.
This place is untouched. You can create a lot of tourist destinations and link them up to packages with Ethiopia. For example, a package where you could visit the towns of Aksum, Gondar, Lalibela in Ethiopia, and Massawa and the Dahlak Islands in Eritrea.
In Massawa, tourists can admire old Ottoman buildings that were damaged during Eritrea's struggle for independence from Ethiopia. Local hotels were also surprised by the diplomatic breakthrough and its consequences in a country that has practically no tourists.
For a long time, we didn't have one single person staying in the hotel, but now we have started to work a lot. We're getting busy. So far, we have not had any complaints about the food or the beds, even though we were not prepared for this number of arrivals, so we're happy.
Eritreans hope the newfound peace will boost the economy of the poor Horn of Africa nation.
My happiness is limitless. Now this place will thrive. There will be a lot of business as our Ethiopian brothers will start coming and having a good time here. We will welcome them with all we have. I think Eritrea will come alive again.
Eritrea became independent from Ethiopia in 1993 and has since then been ruled by authoritarian leader Isaias Afwerki. His critics hope peace will not only mean more tourists, but also more individual freedoms for Eritreans.
That's all for this edition, but do stay with us. There's more news coming up next.